differently this semester. I'm going to try to get away from the multiple choice test. For the 14 years, 14 and a half I've taught, I've used multiple choice test, and I've learned that some students just simply cannot do well on a multiple guess test. I don't know why. Both government tests are multiple choice. A lot of your achievement tests, multiple choice, GRE test, and whatever. But nevertheless, some students do not do well. I wound up last semester giving a short answer test, and a bunch of pupils who had not done well on multiple choice wound up doing really well. So I'm making up a new test, the first of which will be given. Let's see, it's on the syllabus, and regrettably I don't have a copy of it. But the first test will be given around January 20th or thereabouts. No, it's on the site. It'll be on chapter 1. Now, we're going to cover chapters 1 through 13, but not all evenly. Partly because I have to teach what I know, and the way I learned it, mostly what I learned was Western civilization. But this is a world history class, so I'll be teaching about India and China, stuff that I never had in school, but that I have learned over the course of self-study. I mean, I'll just tell you up front, I never studied Indian history or Chinese history or African history, not formally, but I'm going to give 4 days to the first chapter, chapter 1, because I think it's important. Then for Greece and Rome, I'm going to give about 3 days apiece to the chapters 4 and 5 on Greece and Rome, again Western, and then about 2 or 3 days apiece on chapters 12 and 13, again they're Western. And then as far as the others, chapter 2, India, chapter 3, China, 1 class apiece on those. Then when we visit medieval China, 1 class apiece. But I'm going to do something different also. I'm going to give 2 lectures on chapter 7, Islam. I guess the reason should be obvious. Islam is extremely important at the present time under the present conditions, so I'm going to emphasize it hard. The Middle East, Islam, I think are extremely relevant, important to modern times. I mean, when I was a kid, the big issue is why study history? It's not relevant. It's dead. Well, I think a lot of it is relevant. What they did 3,000 and 4,000 years ago and 700-800 years ago strongly influences our world today. Extremely strongly influenced. In fact, without them having done what they did, we would not be here. So, yes, it is important. All right. So much for the overview. Next class, I'll go over the syllabus, because most of you don't have it now, but I'll call roll at about 9 o'clock or 9:15, thereabouts. There are 35 pupils registered for this class, and it being the first day of class, it looks like some of you are having a little bit of trouble finding your way in, and I understand. Folks, it hasn't been all that long ago. I was once in your shoes, like 45 years ago. That's another issue. Yeah, that hasn't been that long. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I had one student today, I can't carry my textbook around. I said, I carry mine around, and I'm 45 years younger than you are. So anyway. And then on the syllabus, you'll find the course requirements. One thing I'm going to try to do a little bit differently. I have 2 classes I'm teaching. I'm part-time now. So keep that in mind. And they want me to tell you that I'm part-time. So in other words, if you want to contact me, use the cell phone number that's on the syllabus. Or you call my wife. The problem I have with cell phones, I leave it off a lot of the time. I mean, older men do that. Call my wife. She'll get in touch with me. But don't call the department secretary. They have some 500 or 600 of you to deal with. And she cannot track me down very easily. So I don't have office hours. Now, what I'm getting around to is makeups. Makeup tests are discouraged, but because the time between my first class and second class is so long, I mean, my first class ends this class ends at 9:45. My second class begins at 2:30. If you can make up a test during those hours, I'll be happy to meet with you. We can work something out. But don't, all right, Now, I say this at the beginning of every semester, and somebody do it anyway. Don't ask me to make a special trip over here. I live in Powder Springs, folks. I simply cannot do it. I'll be coming here Mondays and Wednesdays. I'm even willing to stay after my last class on Monday. Now, Wednesday I want to leave the campus right away. But Monday, I'm willing to stay if you need to take makeups. All right. Now, I know all of you are interested in grades. I want to say this about grades. 2/3 of my pupils wind up making A's and B's, the ones who finish. And if you're not one of them, I'm sorry, but I don't believe everybody should make A's and B's. I think that to make an A, you have to keep up with the other students in the class who are also making A's. So your average has to be within 10 points of the top student in order for you to make an A. And since I'm giving new set of tests, I don't know how well you do on them, so yes, I'll continue to grade on a curve. If the test is too hard, now I'll curve only if I need to. Now, supposing about 2 or 3 of you make hundreds, and there'll be no curve. So I say curve tongue-in-cheek. It depends on how well the top students do. But you have to stay within the 10 points of the top students to make an A, and within 20 points of the top student to make a B. And I have never seen any of you before that I know of, so I have no idea what any of your academic abilities are. I'll find out in a few weeks. There'll be 3 tests given before the drop deadline. Now, again, this means, first test, you might not know what level of preparation you have to make an A on, but to pass my test. The low score then will be thrown out. If by the 3rd test you cannot pass my test, you cannot keep up with your classmates, then I would urge you to seriously consider dropping. I hate saying that, but to say it tongue-in-cheek, but folks, there are some persons who either due to personal conflicts or due to just simply cannot keep up. I know none of you heard what I said. Anyway, I know. I don't know. Folk, student, how come I can't make better than a 60? Folk, I don't know why. Because I'm not with you when you study. I don't know anything about your study habits. In the 14 years I've been here, there was one student I recommended that she drop. I recommended she be dropped. She was making 30s on my quizzes when everybody else was making at least 60 or 70. And in her case, just by talking to her, I could tell the problem was sheer lack of ability. The other teachers thought so too. She was removed from the college. But that's only happened once in 14 and a half years to me. Again, if you're not college material, then you can be a success. Find something else to do. I've changed careers 5 or 6 times in my lifetime. And my wife and I visited the Churchill exhibit yesterday, and he changed careers about 8 or 10 times with Winston Churchill. Find out what you can do best and do it. All right. Oh yes, withdrawal from the class. Now, folk, all the teachers I've talked to have this problem, and I don't know why. If you have to withdraw from the class, go through the formality of withdrawing, particularly before the drop deadline. If you don't, if you just simply quit coming to class without withdrawing, the only thing I can do for you is give you an F for the course. And folks, that will stay with you the rest of your life. You might not realize now how serious that is, but it is a serious issue. Well, okay, you can get a grade raise by repeating the course later. Yeah, you can do that, but again, you can save yourself a lot of trouble and me some agony if you can't continue the course. Go online or go to the registrar's office and formally withdraw. Now, I'm saying that knowing that there's going to be 2 or 3 of you listening to me right now who's just going to go ahead and stop coming to class. Again, if you do that, I have no choice but to give you an F for the course. Extra work, extra credit is frowned on, but there's 2 ways you can get extra credit, and that's on the syllabus. One way is to attend the symposiums that are here from time to time. And again, a lot of teachers doing that, and this was encouraged. I got permission from the department head here to do that, Mario Benick and my name, and they liked that. So you can attend and get 2 points added to your final average, up to 10 points, which would change your grade by letter. That's one way. The other way is to turn in your projects ahead of time. There are 2 projects. And folk, I really want to teach you students how to write. And up until now, I've been assigning a paper, which they turn in on iCollege, and some of the papers were really good. But this time, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to write the paper and let you grade it. The paper will contain numerous errors, some pretty obvious, and some not so obvious. I want you to put in commas where I left them out if they're needed. And if I put in commas that are not needed, I want you to take them out. There will be some deliberately misspelled words. I want you to correct those. But other than grammar and syntax, there'll be some sentences that are very poorly written and a bunch of short, choppy sentences. I want you to correct that. And because what I'm going to do is give you some of the stuff I wind up reading. And there'll be a sentence or two that just simply doesn't seem to make sense. Again, that's what I wind up reading. I want you to try to determine what I was trying to say and write that in. And if you can decide what I meant to say, what I was trying to. There'll be 2 such projects. One of them due in February, I believe, and the other one due in April. It's on the syllabus. But you'll be correcting me. The paper, I call it paper, the projects will be on iCollege as soon as they're ready. All right. That'll be the projects, the extra credit. You can get extra credit for turning those things in early. And again, the reason I do that is it makes things easy on me. I'll add 6 points to the grade I'd otherwise give if you turn it in early. And guess what? Guess who turns in their papers early for extra credit? Folks, anybody know? Anybody want to guess the type of student who will turn their papers in early for extra credit? Usually, yes. Usually an A or an A+ student who doesn't need the extra points anyway. Same way with the ones who attend the symposiums. Oftentimes the ones who attend are A students who don't need the extra credit or the extra points. And what I do is grit my teeth, give them the extra points, and let the rest of them slide. The rest of you slide. All right, I'm human too. Okay, I'm about to start with the lesson. All right, before I do, I'll have more to say about the syllabus and the project as the semester goes on, but just an overview, quick overview. Anybody have any other questions, comments? All right, if not, we'll get started. Chapter 1. I just finished telling you I would stay close to the textbook, but on Chapter 1, I'm going to take the liberty to deviate more than I will any other chapter. Quite honestly, because I have some personal disagreements with the way the authors approach this topic, as you'll find out in a few minutes. But anyway, the standard view of world history is that mankind started out possibly as a chimpanzee, and again it varies. I mean, yes, I can find you one article on the internet where that man started out as a lemur, but that has not gotten that has not gotten very much headway. But that generally it's, well, all right, when I was in college, our nearest relative was the great apes, the gorilla. Then that moved from the chimp, and now I believe there's another one that's closer than a chimp called the bonobo, B-O-N-O-B-O. Anyone know how to pronounce that word? Bonobo or whatever. It's supposed to be a little bit closer to the chimp. Anyway, then mankind broke away from the chimp and became at first very primitive. The earliest culture is called the Paleolithic. By the way, all right, you may notice I put that on a board. I want to tell you, folks, there are no study guides to this course, and I could go into my reasons why, but essentially the main reason is I do want you to read the book. Very strongly, I feel strongly about that. I want you to read a book. And Um, Also, the study guides seem to encourage students from not reading the book. But anyway, there are no study guides. But the stuff I put on the board, you can expect to see it again. Anyway, the earliest culture, Paleolithic, that essentially means Old Stone Age. Then, of course, there was the Neolithic. And of course, in between was the Mesolithic. Or you might say Middle Stone Age. And Paleo, that means old. Neo means new. That supposedly mankind started out really primitive and eventually developed language or ability to speak to each other. Eventually he learned to domesticate animals and found that some plants made for good domestication, so we learned how to cultivate certain plants, wheat, corn, barley, apples, oranges, numerous fruit plants, carrots, radishes, whatever. He learned how to cultivate, and then he changed from being a food gatherer to a food producer, and eventually developed what we might call civilization. Now, that word civilization, I mean, when I was a kid, a teacher asked me what that word means, and I said, well, it means the ability to write. That's part of it. The word civilization comes from the word civil. It means that you have an organized society, or a civil society. Civilization involves more than just writing. You have, in a civilization, you have a hierarchy. In other words, you have a man at the top, a leader, and under him is another class of nobles who help him, the leader, govern. And you have a priestly class, some kind of religion. It involves usually an army to keep order and to protect people. And of course, armies are sometimes used to conquer. And of course, yes, it does involve writing, schools, but it involves differentiation of duties. In other words, one man over here might be a blacksmith. His neighbor then might be a tanner. And then outside the city walls there'd be a bunch of farmers. And farming, until the invention of the combine and the reaper, 90% of your population down through the ages were farmers. It took 90% of people being farmers to support the other 10% who were not. And then, of course, there's always the scholars, the scribes, people who keep the records. All this is part of your civilization, or the civil society. You have courts to settle disputes somewhat peacefully. Courts, armies, schools. All this is part of the process of civilization. And supposedly, mankind eventually evolved into a civilized society. Then he built cities. Well, cities is part of civilization. All right. That's the standard overview of the way things supposedly happened, how man started out from scratch and worked his way up by his own bootstraps. Now, before I proceed, about $100 to have your DNA sampled. And essentially, this is a DNA genograph map of the world. That's what they're trying to do. Before human beings get so moved that you can't tell where they came from, they're trying to trace the movement of peoples from an original source and trace them back to an original source to make an attempt to tell where it came from. Now, back in 1986, there was a few waves made when it was discovered, and this, by the way, confirms that study, that all human females are descended from one woman. Does anybody know what they call this woman? And then, no, it's not Lucy. Eve. That name Eve comes from a book that is not allowed in our nation's public schools. Nevertheless, I mean, this is college and you're all adults, so. They call her mitochondrial Eve. She's the ancestor of all living women. Might not be the ancestor of all women who ever lived, but the ancestor of all women who live today. And shortly afterward, they discovered that all men pass their male Y chromosome, DNA, down from father to son, down through the generations, that all men are descended from one man. They call his name Adam. All right. Now, again, that name also comes from, by the way, the same book I'm going to call the Forbidden Book because it's not allowed in our nation's schools. And by the way, the issue of free speech is a really hot issue right now in our world today. And believe it or not, Western democracies are being the worst cases in the world to outlaw free speech. If you don't believe it, just try to say certain things and you'll find yourself deeper in hot water than you can get out of. I'm talking about the United States, particularly in France, which has made a lot of news. Certain kind of speech is okay and certain kinds of speech is strictly, strongly forbidden. But anyway, back to the story of Adam and Eve. In this study, they have Eve living far before Adam did, which should not surprise any of you if you think it through. And of course, they're trying to explain, well, Eve would have lived before Adam because human females down through history have oftentimes married outside their tribe and been transferred to another tribe, while the males remained in the tribe. I think it has nothing to do with DNA. But folk, I think everybody in here has heard a story of a certain disaster that overtook the earth one time where everybody died in the disaster except for one man and that man's sons and that man's wife and the wives of his sons. And that would explain why that the male DNA is closer to the male Adam is closer to modern times than the female Eve, mitochondrial DNA of mitochondrial Eve. Essentially, though, folk, what we're getting at is, among other things, is there's only one race. And I've worked with an anthropologist who's also part-time, and he teaches the same thing. There's only one race, and that race is the human race. All humankind are, in fact, brothers. If you want to take another look, more detail at this, that's fine. By the way, in my case, my genotype was R1b, and again, that's basically I share the same genotype as the Cro-Magnon man, who I'll talk about in a few minutes. Most European males have the genotype R1b. Now, none of my sisters have done it. My sisters might come up with different results because my sister would trace a line through their mother, my mother, the mother and grandmother and great-grandmother and off down through the female line, while the men could trace their DNA through the male line. Now, again, with today's world, they can give a much more detailed account than we could back in 2005 when I had this study done on me. And you might wonder, why haven't I done it? And it costs $100 a piece, which, you have to be careful when how you spend your money. So, but I'm very interested. All right. Another thing now that this map shows is the human family groups, particularly on the female line, tend to spread out to a place on the globe called Mount Ararat. It's right, you can't see it, but if you want to get a more detailed look, you're welcome to come up here after class. The female, all right, they have them, that Eve started out in Africa, but then her descendants apparently went straight from Africa to the region of Mount Ararat. Does anybody know what is significant about Mount Ararat? I'm getting back to the same story I was just talking about. In the story of Noah and the ark supposedly landed on Mount Ararat, which would explain why you'd have a divergence from that region. The male line apparently starts out from Babylon, Tower of Babel. It's right here in orange and white for the female, blue and white for the male lines. And then as mankind diverged from his places of origin throughout the globe. All right, in other words, folks, the flood story is not just written in the folklore of every ancient ethnic group, every ancient location. I caught myself using the word race, which I don't want to use. It's written in our genes. All right. Having said that, again, the standard view is eventually you had two types of humans, the Neanderthal. That word has been pronounced Neanderthal, both are correct, and the Cro-Magnon. Neanderthal. Now, there's some controversy. Oh yeah, then of course you have modern Homo sapiens. It is now known that Homo sapiens, at least some of us, are descended from the Cro-Magnon man. Now, the controversy is the Neanderthal man an ancestor or a cousin? And folk, it depends on what you read and when you read it. A lot of your graves show Neanderthal and Homo sapiens being buried side by side. It's known that Neanderthal man buried his dead. Now, at one time they said Neanderthal man was a primitive caveman who didn't even have the ability to talk. And they used all they could find in his bone, but they said due to something about his skeletal structure, he could not have formed vocal cords. Well, now we know this to not necessarily be true. What I must say about both of these men, though, they averaged 6 foot tall, which is even taller than modern man averages. And they both had a larger brain capacity than modern man. And I have a book at the house, and at least one author believes that both men lived hundreds of years. They can tell this by the way his teeth is formed and shaped, that ours would form and shape that way if we could live 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 years. Which we don't anymore, but according to old records, not just about old records, we once did live hundreds of years. In other words, what I'm getting at, folk, is modern Homo sapiens is not a rising up, but a falling down from a higher form of life. What do I mean? Am I saying that ancient man was more advanced than we are? All right. The pyramids of Egypt. Could we build them today with our technology? I've heard that we can't. Then how did they build them? In South America, I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff in South America. And even your authors will state that some people believe that to build those miles and miles long of straight lines, somebody had to be observing from space and radioing down to the people below where to put the lines. Even your authors will go that far. But also in Cuzco, there's stone structure 13,000 feet straight in your, they have the ocean. Yeah, right here's the ocean, and a almost straight up cliff, 13,000 feet. The stones that were quarried right down here and raised 13,000 feet. And folk, we don't have the ability to do that today, even with our biggest cranes. And the the stones, no two are alike, and yet they all fit together, interlocking like a piece of a puzzle perfectly. How did they do it? They had more abilities than we have. I'm going to dare state that. Now, that sounds weird. I'm sorry, but it's going to get weirder still. Wait till I get to chapter 2 on India and start talking about the Vedas. Have any of you heard about the Veda writings of the Vedas? They describe space travel, spacecraft, and airplanes. I'll tell you that much. Folk, the Vedas were written before Moses lived. Very, very old. All right. Now, which brings me up to the next point. What is history? How do we get history? All right. Essentially, folk, history is the people who lived at that time wrote their records, and we read what they wrote. These are called primary sources. Then later historians will try to piece together what they wrote. We call these secondary. Now, your textbook is mostly a secondary source. But you have primary sources, persons who lived at the time. Now, the problem with most primary sources is they tend to get old and fade. Paper has never been shown to last more than maybe 15 or 1800 years, and that's only if it's carefully preserved. And even then, it's pretty well faded. Stone writings, now they're the best way to preserve writings. But when we come to reading, for instance, when we read about Julius Caesar, we're reading somebody who lived at the time, who knew him, wrote about him, but his writings faded, so somebody copied, and we're reading copies of a copy of a copy. Same way with the Bible. With all due respect, you're reading a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Now we come to the first civilization, the Sumerians. By the way, have any of you ever heard of these people? Sumerian? Yeah. My first graduate paper was on the Sumerians. All right. Unlike other peoples, the Sumerians wrote on clay tablets. And folk, when we dig up their clay tablets and read them, we are actually reading original sources that have not been altered or copied in any way. I mean, all right, most of you are probably familiar with the game of gossip. If I were to start a rumor in this part of the room, by the time I got back to that corner, it would be totally different from what I actually originally said. Each person would alter a little bit. In the case of the Sumerians, what they wrote is not altered, because what they wrote is as original can get. Okay, so we actually have some original writings. Isn't that great? Then you start reading what they wrote, and folk, we don't believe them. What they wrote was too weird and too far out for our minds to comprehend. Modern day political correctness and scholarship cannot really handle it. All right, your book does give at least one example. All right, on page 12 of your text. Now that might be on a different page if you use a different text. I want to read it. That's a city in Sumer, is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. Our gods have abandoned us like migrating birds, or abandoned us like migrating birds. Smoke lies on our city like a shroud. What he's describing, folk, is smoke. Anybody know what kind of a weapon would produce that kind of smoke? Mushroom blast? Nuclear bomb. Now, folk, you don't have to believe it, but this was written more than 3,000 years ago. Now, you might read, oh, our gods have left the temples, they've abandoned us. And you might think they're speaking spiritually, they're speaking figuratively. No, the Sumerians believed their gods maintained a physical, actual presence, not idols, but physical presence in their temples, and that they had the ability to fly. And when the destruction hit, their gods abandoned them, took off, and flew away from the destruction because they couldn't stand to be there either. What he's describing is the same thing that we saw when the nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Bodies just melting away or dissolving into a vapor, disappearing into a vapor. This is an original source. Now, if you look it up on the internet, you'll find, oh yeah, I mean, just look up is destroyed, and they'll say this is just a lament. The people were prone to exaggerate. You can believe that if you want to. It's up to whatever you choose to believe. Now, many years ago, about 12 or 13 years ago, one student wrote something on a paper that I'll never forget. I had him assigned to do 3 papers, and one of them had to be on the Sumerians. So everybody had to write a 3-page paper on the Sumerian, but one line in it, this girl wrote, what you believe about the Sumerians depends on your worldview, whether it be religious or philosophical. what you choose to believe. If you hold to a purely materialistic secular worldview, that's fine. You can hold that, but you have some explaining to do. Or if you hold to a more spiritual worldview, again, the Sumerians believed that their gods came down from heaven and set up a physical presence in their temples, and folk even went so far as to cohabit with earth women and produce a race of hybrids, or demigods, who were part human and part mortal. Now, before you think it's too far out, I wanted to remind you something. Every ancient people that we have any record of believed this. The Greeks, all right, who is Hercules' father? All of you know. Zeus. Yes. So Hercules, part god and part mortal. Now, eventually, who did Alexander the Great claim his father was? If any of you know. Zeus. Alexander the Great would march in battle, not like the other generals. He marched first, his army was behind him, and he was the first person to engage the enemy. And he never lost a fight. He finally was wounded, yes, in India, by an arrow, but some people say that the arrow should have read missile. That only in India did they have weapons that could hurt him. Giant stories flood ancient literature. You don't have to believe it, but the ancients taught this as not as mythology, but as true history. All right. You have, when you start reading their writings, folks, the original sources, we classify the original ones as myths. These are stories involving gods. Then come the legends. These involve the demigods. Now, among the legends, I've already mentioned Hercules. There's also the story of Gilgamesh, whom your book mentions. Gilgamesh supposedly was more god than he was human, because both his father was totally god and his mother was more than half god. That made him, according to the records, 2/3 god and 1/3 human. But the legends, they involve the part god and part men. Again, stories that we hardly believe. Then finally you get to true history. Sometimes we call these fairy tales. Now, again, folk, every ancient people begin their histories with stories that we would call fairy tales. Fairy tales have three types of beginnings. They can begin with long ago and far away, once upon a time, and a third beginning, back when I was in the Army. What follows is often a fairy tale. They always have a unique ending. How do fairy tales usually end? And they lived happily ever after. Yeah, I saw this cartoon of his dad reading to his young daughter, and they lived happily ever after on Social Security. The book was a book of fairy tales, by the way. Yeah. All right. Anyway, again, do these stories have any basis at all in reality? Now, we're going to come to this when we talk about Greek and Indian history. The Greeks, their Iliad and Odyssey, we consider them legend. Gods are involved. The Greeks looked on these stories as being true history. And that's why we wind up calling Herodotus the father of history, and Herodotus lived in 300 BCE. Well, what about the stories written before then? Oh, they're myth and legend, not true history. Herodotus left out a lot of that stuff, a lot of the supernatural. We'll be talking more about this later. But the original stories, as they come down to us, start off with stories that, quite frankly, we don't believe. Why do I mention this? Simply, we discuss our faculty meetings. Is it about you or is it about me? Well, one thing for sure, this course is not about me. Perhaps it's about you, but also, folk, you must understand the mindset of these people who lived back then. And they had a different mind than we have. Far different. They did not separate the spiritual from the temporal. And folk, even as recently as 1600, Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, did not know the difference between magic and science. Show Sir Isaac Newton a device like this one, he'd think it was magical. He'd be consistent it was a mystical device. Again, didn't know the difference, so he'd think this room was lit by mystical lighting devices. They didn't know the difference either. They did not separate religion from science. No conflict between theology and science in the ancient world. Theology, science were the same thing, and the people in Egypt we call priests. The Egyptians looked on them as being scientists, but their science was almost what we would call theology. They didn't know the difference. This, you have to understand, was their mindset. Now, whether you believe it or not, we can't go on in the story without understanding that they believed it. All right. By the way, the city I mentioned, the city of Ur. Now, you can go there today. Nobody lives there anymore, of course. But does anybody know a very well-known personage started his life in the city of Ur? Does anybody know who I'm talking about? Abraham. And I've read at least one author, Jewish author, who believes that Abraham got out of the city just before the destruction hit. And today's Jewish people are the only known descendants of the Sumerians. And when I say Abraham was son, in no way, in any way, being slanderous to the Jewish people. I mean, my wife is a part Jew. But Abraham started out in the city of Ur, which was a Sumerian city, and got out apparently before the big destruction that your book talks about. All right. Now, another thing about these ancient civilizations, they tended to locate on the banks of rivers, and this was to remain true for many, many generations. In the case of the Sumerians, the two rivers were the Tigris and Euphrates. And the land between the rivers is called Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia is a geographic term. It's not a nation. Never was a nation. It's just a geographic term. It means the land between the Tigris, Euphrates rivers. This area is sometimes called the cradle of civilization. Now, if you actually look at the place, why would mankind choose that place as the place to begin a civilization, folk, when there's nothing there but clay? And we don't know. There's no metals, not a significant amount of metals. Now, today we know that there's a lot of oil in that region, but at that time, they did not know that. A lot of clay. They used the clay to build houses and to write. Their cities, they built a lot of cities, and among them Ur and Umma, and don't worry about the names, Lagash and Babylon. And they learned how to set up schools. It's believed that they invented the wheel. The fact that until the Chinese, these were the most inventive people. I mean, they invented writing, they invented the wheel, they invented civil government. They started using money. That's, by the way, money is part of civilization. Money is a means of exchange, and they set up trade. Folk, you have to, I mean, history books talk a lot about trade. Why they come on? Why is trade so important? You can't build a device like this without trade, because the materials you need, some of it come from this part of the continent, some others come from that part, others come from another continent entirely. You have to be able to get all the material you need together in one place before you can put devices together. And there's no place in the world that has everything you need, hence the importance of trade. The Sumerians, we know they had trade. Anyway, they started their civilization along the banks of rivers. The rivers supplied them with the water they needed for drinking and for irrigation. A lot of their crops would not grow without irrigation. Of course, their camels needed water also. So it's believed that they learned how to domesticate plants, domesticate animals. The cat, the dog, is believed to have first been domesticated by them, not to mention the camel, the sheep, the horse. They got man started on a road towards civilization, again, according to standard story. And then they disappeared from memory. Forgotten about. Until about 200 years ago, we began digging them up and began to say, hey, who were these people? And found out, hey, they were the ones who really got us started. It's believed that all religions can be traced to Sumeria, including the Chinese religion and the religions of India. That's the Sumerians. There were their main gods like Enki, Enlil, Anu, Marduk. Marduk is believed to be associated with the Roman Mars, M-A-R-S, or Ares. The Greeks called him Ares, Romans called him Mars. Anu, you see the word Uranus, Uranus, U-R-A-N-U-S, again, comes from Anu. The Anu was the first one of them in Greek mythology. Uranus was the first one of the gods. Enlil has been associated with storms, or Jupiter or Thor. Storms, thunder, lightning. Again, a lot of persons say that it can be traced back to ancient Sumer. And if you go into more detail, some people say that these religions were started by one woman, known by various names, Isis, and that word Isis keeps appearing folk in front of us. Isis, Ishtar, Inanna, Semiramis. And you ever heard of any of these names? Surely you've heard of Isis in the modern world. Right? Keeps appearing over and over again down throughout history. All right. Anyway, these people got us started out. I want to say something about the Sumerian language. In our writing, most of the time, we spell words somewhat the way they sound. You come to a word like, and all of you know this, how do you pronounce this? Pounds. It's not spelled at all the way it sounds. But that's an exception. And we do have a word pounds, we spell P-O-U-N-D-S. The entire Sumerian tongue, folk, was written like this. We know that because we have more Sumerian writings than we have of all the other ancient cultures combined, more than we have of Greece and Rome combined. And among them we have dictionaries and lexicons, and dictionaries contain pronunciations. The word pounds comes from the Latin word libre. So it's believed it's a Sumerian language. They learned how to write in one language, and then all of a sudden they still use the same symbols when they started speaking another language. What was the original language? Folk, we don't even know if they do. We don't know. But it brings back to a topic that's, again, you'll find in the Forbidden Book, a story that one day they all woke up and found they could not understand each other's speech. I'm talking about the Tower of Babel. If this story were true, we could expect that what we find would be what we are finding. Their language, their written language, did not match their spoken tongue. By the way, the Tower of Babel is mentioned, the incident, and this confusion of languages is mentioned in the Sumerian writings also. So it wasn't just something that Jewish people made up or that Moses made up. It was a story that was passed down throughout the ancient world. All right. Now, so much for the overview, and yes, I'm very much aware that time is getting away from me. The area that we're talking about also, I mean, in addition to being called Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia is part of an area called the Fertile Crescent. Because on a map it is somewhat crescent shaped. I mean, well, I'll show you. This green area is a Fertile Crescent. Again, somewhat because it's surrounded on all sides by areas that are that are not so fertile. In other words, there's desert in Arabia and mountainous regions in Turkey. Fertile Crescent is an area where they will produce crops. And but other than that, the Fertile Crescent is surrounded by areas that are difficult to inhabit. Now, Egypt is really part of the Sahara Desert, except Egypt has the Nile River flowing through it, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. All right. Now, who were the people? We have some names, and one of the first names I'll introduce you to is a man named Sargon. Sargon built himself up an empire. Now, in those days, folk, it was looked on as being fashionable. If you were a king and you were more powerful than your neighbors, and you had a better civilization, you had an obligation or a right and a duty to go and conquer the weaker peoples. And you might wonder, what is so great about conquest? Because in the modern world, we have outlawed conquest. But folk, until about 120 years ago, empire building and conquest was looked on as being a virtue. All that changed, particularly after World War I and World War II, when colonial peoples rebelled. But it was looked on as being, if you're more civilized than peoples elsewhere, you have a duty to spread the light of your civilization to these peoples and to overpower and to conquer them and to force them into your way of living. Now, I'm not in any way saying it's right, but you have to understand this is what they thought. So this was a justification they used for conquest, and they had another justification, folk, something we might have a hard time understanding. If you didn't conquer these people, number one, they would come in and conquer you. Or number two, they would come in and steal your children away or your wives and go and take them and use them as slaves. This was a real problem in the ancient world. The problem the Chinese had and the problem that people had. So it was up to you to make sure that these people got conquered and put in their place so they would not come in and steal everything you have and then run and leave and enjoy everything that you'd worked for to build up all your life. So conquest was looked on as being a virtue. Sargon built up a great empire. Now I'll close with this. Sargon was a Semite. And yes, on my way in this morning, I heard that word Semite being used. And Semite, what do we mean by, anyone have any idea? What does Semite mean? But how many, and again, I'm surprised how many college students don't know this. Anti-Semite. What do you mean when you say this person is anti-Semitic? Again, some of you should know this. Against Jews. Anti-Semite. The Jews were Semite. The word Semite means descended from Noah's son Shem, of whom the Jews were. Sargon was a Semite. Now, who were Semitic people? Well, the Assyrians, we'll talk about next time. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Amorites, among others, and the Edomites. These were Semites, and of course the Jews. I think personally the Sumerians also were. But anyway, the Jews, the Semite people do Semite. Now, anti-Semite is a word used to describe people who are against Jews. And folk, it's a big, big problem in our world today. Super big problem. And for all I know, I mean, I don't know anything about any of it. Some of you might be anti-Semite. But it came to a head during Adolf Hitler's reign in Germany. He was as anti-Semitic as there were, but anti-Semitism is coming back in on the scene again, really strong. And it came in strong last week, and particularly in the area around Paris, France. So it's not something, I mean, folk, again, what anti-Semitism has been going on for some 3,000 years. But anyway, Sargon was a Semite who built himself up an empire. And we used to look on him as being the first real historic figure, the first figure we know who actually existed. Now we're going farther back and saying some of these people on the old king list were real. And folks, someday we might even go as far back enough to say that Gilgamesh, who would have lived before Sargon if he lived at all, was a real person. But if we do that, we're going to wind up saying Hercules was a real person. We're not to that point yet. But it depends on how much of these ancient fairy tales, how much of these ancient mythologies will wind up proving to be true. All right, before we leave, I do